All right, so we've talked about Black civil rights, we've talked about Latino civil rights, and now we're going to talk about Asian American and Native American civil rights. First thing to note here, when we talk about Asian American civil rights, same thing that applied really when we talked about Latino civil rights, right? The Asian American label is kind of like an umbrella term that encompasses a lot of diverse subgroups within that broad category. So we would note here, right, when you say Asian American, it could be Japanese American, right? That community with its own particular historical arc, its own particular issues, perhaps. Chinese Americans, Korean Americans, Vietnamese Americans. I lived in Wisconsin for many years. We had a pretty large political refugee population of those who had fled the Vietnam War after the U.S. withdrew, and a lot of our allies were Cambodian and Laotian, and they were given expedited refugee status and resettled mostly in the smaller cities across the upper Midwest, interestingly enough. So again, right, that's a different community, a different arc than, let's say, and that, they would have come over in about the early to mid 1980s. So that group, right, would have a very different historical arc than, let's say, Japanese Americans who've been here for many generations. Right, different language, different culture, different issues. Indian American, those from India, and then lots of other subgroups there. And typically, we might note here that as a group, Asian Americans are kind of the highest ranked in terms of both education and income, ranked above whites, blacks, Latinos, and so forth. A lot of that is Indian Americans. And those who've come over from India tend to be highly educated and affluent. Helps to explain some of that. It's also true, I think, pretty unfortunately, that some have used Asian Americans, right, given their relatively high status here in America in terms of income and education. They've kind of promulgated this myth of the model minority and used it to kind of attack black Americans, Latinos. Like, what's your problem? Asian Americans have done great. What's your problem? Come on, you're comparing apples to oranges there. These are very different communities. Different physical traits, different culture, different historical trajectories, so different. So it's a cheap argument, but on the surface I realize it has a lot of appeal for some. I don't think Asian Americans appreciate being used as a wedge against other minority groups. All right, now look, this is just an introductory course. We're flying at 30,000 feet here, so we're going to leave a ton out. So things that come up if we're thinking about Asian American civil rights. Early days, if you look at the Naturalization Act of 1790, and this would not have been specific to Asian Americans, but it would certainly apply to them. The Naturalization Act of 1790, federal law, stated that only free white immigrants were eligible for citizenship, right? So that meant a whole lot of other groups who immigrated here would never be eligible for citizenship, unless, of course, right, they come here, don't get citizenship, and then their kids, right, born on American soil, because of the 14th Amendment, which comes later, would be natural-born citizens. We talked about this a little bit, right? The United States induced people from China to come over in the 1870s to help build the Trans-Pacific Rail through the Sierra Nevada mountain range. Dangerous, difficult work. I think like 90% of the labor force for that dangerous work through the mountains was Chinese immigrants. Lauded initially by white people as, you people are fantastic, you're such good workers, you're so smart, you're so wonderful. But once the rail was built through the Sierra Nevadas, right, and you drive that golden spike in Promontory, Utah to connect east and west, those two lines, Right? Then they were persona non grata. Why are you still here? You people creep us out. We don't like your culture, your language. Get out of here. Right? Lots of harsh treatment, legally, socially, economically. Very harsh at the state, local, and federal levels. The burning of Reno's Chinatown, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Check that out. I have a link there that you can click if you're looking at this in the PowerPoint version. The California Alien Land Act of 1913 that said those who've come over from China and are not native born cannot own property in California. All sorts of terrible treatment of Chinese immigrants once the Trans-Pacific Rail line was fundamentally built. And of course, right, the internment of Japanese Americans after Pearl Harbor, about, I think over 100,000. About 3/4 of those put in internment camps were indeed U.S. citizens. Right, we were in a panic after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. It was a popular policy promulgated by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And the idea was, right, you people haven't done anything wrong yet, but we're worried you might in the future. So preemptive strike. We're going to move all of you who are living on the West Coast and put you in these internment camps. No evidence of any wrongdoing. Right? The Supreme Court looked at it, right, for Fifth Amendment issues. Because the Fifth Amendment says that people cannot be denied life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Right? Was there due process here? Obviously not. The court kind of glossed over that and said, war is hell. Deal with it. This is an emergency. Much later, in 1988, Congress issued a bill that was signed by President Ronald Reagan, and they gave $20,000 in reparations to surviving members of those camps. And President Reagan issued a heartfelt apology to those who had been interned. We look upon that now, of course, with a great deal of shame and regret. Were German Americans similarly targeted? Not really. Were Italian Americans similarly targeted? No. Those are the three Axis powers there: Germany, Italy, and Japan. Japanese Americans were singled out. I think you can figure out why. Today, of course, you would say, right, for the Asian American community here in America, vast improvements. A lot of political empowerment at the local level in a lot of cities in California, Honolulu in Hawaii, and really all of Hawaii. I believe Asian Americans are the majority in Hawaii. So but those are the islands, right, of Asian American political empowerment would be California and Hawaii. But also true, and I know this from having lived in Wisconsin, if you're talking about Indian Americans, yeah, very affluent and educated. If you're talking about political refugees who came over after the Vietnam War, much less affluent, much less educated. A lot of variation within that Asian American community. And of course, right, we have a pretty large Asian American community right here in Las Vegas. So a certain amount of empowerment comes with that when you have concentrated numbers of a minority group at the local level. So you have some of that here in Las Vegas. I wouldn't want to overplay it. All right, switching over now to Native American civil rights. Boy, you could teach a semester-long course on this, maybe multiple semesters. So again, we're flying at 30,000 feet. I'll just say a few things here. It is a brutal history. It is a brutal history. It's really super genocidal in so many ways, both culturally and physically. Right, so when native settlers arrived from England, early days, early to mid 1600s, right? They were like, oh, Native Americans, we respect you. You guys have figured out how to live here. You can help us figure it out. Everything's cool. Just make a little room for us. 50-50. Right? But as you got more and more white people coming over, and white people became more numerous and more powerful. And look, right, once you get European contact with indigenous peoples in North America and South America and Central America, up and down the Americas, right? What happened was Europeans brought with them, not intentionally, but they brought with them diseases that they had picked up in Europe from living alongside farm animals for hundreds of years, right? So those who survived those early animal-borne diseases in Europe, a lot of them didn't, right? The plague and all that. Those who survived, right, and reproduced had natural resistance to these animal-borne diseases. The problem, right, for indigenous people was in the Americas, they did not have farm animals and did not have any immunity to any of this stuff. So when white people came over from Europe, man, the level of death brought by Europeans for natives was, I've heard that within like 150 years, 95%, there was a 95% reduction in the indigenous communities in the Americas after European contact because of disease. So Native Americans were getting smaller and smaller in number, weaker and weaker. White people, right, bigger and bigger in numbers and more powerful. So then the deal became, what are you doing here? You're in the way. You're inferior. You're barbaric. You're savage. You're primitive. We're culturally superior. Get out of the way. And it became increasingly hostile, whites towards indigenous people who fought back as best they could, but they were not able to fight back very effectively over time. Initially, they were able to fight back very effectively militarily, but over time that dwindled and the power balance shifted dramatically. Those that pushed to get natives, right, onto reservations and pushed west endlessly. The feds would constantly break these treaties once it became apparent that there were even more white people coming, migrating west. That land that you're on, that we agreed to earlier, is valuable to us. Go further west. We'll break that treaty. We'll make another. As we spread west and even more people, we'll break that treaty and push you further west until you end up on the worst pieces of land as far west as possible. Just brutal. The Indian Removal Act passed by Congress under President Andrew Jackson, a noted Indian fighter and Indian hater. He had profound disregard for Native peoples. And out of that comes the Trail of Tears, forced removal of the Cherokee and other tribes out of the American southeast and pushed west. 60,000 were moved, walked, marched under military escorts, and many thousands died. Just horrible. Men, women, children, the elderly, the whole 9 yards. Just frickin' brutal. You get Worcester v. Georgia in 1832. A little bit of ray of hope here for indigenous people. It is a decision in favor of the Cherokee and against the state of Georgia, telling Georgia, you have no jurisdiction over the Cherokee. The Cherokee had actually tried to assimilate. They thought that's the way white people will no longer kill us or push us around. We'll assimilate and we'll become as white as they are. That's what the Cherokee down in Georgia did. They assimilated. They even adopted the institution of slavery. Okay? Guess what? Guess what, right? It was never good enough for white people in Georgia. They could never really be white. They could pretend to be white, right? But they couldn't really be white. So all of the efforts of the Cherokee, right? Because I said, we can't beat them. We're going to have to join them. And the white people said, you can't beat us, but you also can't join us. Never. Right, so the court actually came down on the side of the Cherokee and against Georgia, but President Jackson laughed and said, I will never enforce that decision. I'm on the side of Georgia. I can't stand the Cherokee. So Georgia was able to do what they wanted, which was to force the Cherokee out of Georgia. It's quite a story. All right, so and it's not coincidental, you see that number there right on the slide, by the early 1880s, Native tribes had been militarily crushed. That's not coincidental, that date, right? Because when was the Civil War over? 1865, right? When could the U.S. turn its full military attention to crushing Native American tribes? The 1870s, right? The 1880s. So not coincidental that once that Civil War is over, the writings on the wall for indigenous tribes that were fighting back with some effectiveness militarily against the U.S. government. It became super lopsided after the Civil War. The Dawes Act of 1887 was an effort, quite honestly, by Congress and the President to destroy Native communities, to disrupt them, to break up Native reservation land. It's a little bit complicated. Check out the link. But effectively, this undermined Native communities, Native political power, and it broke up Native land and dispersed it mostly to white people, as white people moved west and wanted that land. Huge chunks of Native land were lost as a result of the Dawes Act. It was eventually repealed, but not until, I believe, the 1930s. Because the Native Americans, right, historically held land communally on behalf of the entire community, and then built a political structure around that arrangement. And the Dawes Act says, screw that. Land is privately owned by individuals, so we're going to break these up. We're going to break community land up into individual parcels. And that spelled doom and gloom for Native communities across the country. Just atrocious. And completely legal. Completely legal. And completely immoral. You do get significant improvements for Native civil rights in the 20th century, generally speaking. You get a guarantee of citizenship for Native peoples in 1924. Before 1924, if you were a registered member of a federally recognized tribe, you could not, you were not a U.S. citizen. You had to choose. Right? But after 1924, you no longer had to choose. You could be a member of a tribe, but also be a U.S. citizen with full citizenship rights. Now, look, I don't want to, be naive here. Look, the 20th century, things got way better for indigenous people, but you still had a lot going against indigenous tribes, even in the 20th century. You had these Indian boarding schools that arose after the Civil War and continued up to about 1980. Let me say that again. Continued up to about 1980. And these were designed to kill the Indian, save the man, right? We're no longer going to conduct a genocidal campaign against indigenous people, but we are going to seize the kids of Native people, Native families. We're going to seize them, often forcibly, cart them off to these boarding schools that are hundreds of miles away, and we're going to try to make them white. And we're going to try to make you as white as possible. Cut your hair, get rid of your clothing, punish you and beat you if you speak the indigenous language, kill the Indian, right? Save the man. These had an atrocious impact on indigenous communities. A number of these kids died at these boarding schools. Parents were never told about it, buried in unmarked graves. That's come to light fairly recently. There was actually one, sadly, up in Reno, the Helen Stewart boarding school. All part of that approach. The most infamous one was the one in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. You could look that up if you were interested. And that didn't come to an end, people, until 1980. Think on that for a minute. On a more positive note, remember how we talked about, right? The 1960s were a decade of ferment and the rise of democratic movements representing marginalized people. That also happens on behalf of Native Americans, the American Indian movement, circa 1968, same year, right, that the Chicano civil rights movement kicked into gear. I would say some real successes for the American Indian movement, certainly broadly in terms of calling the attention of the American people to the plight of indigenous people in the late 20th century. One of their more well-known acts was the occupation of Alcatraz. I was just there recently. They've kept a lot of the markers of that occupation, quite interesting. The occupation of Alcatraz, the occupation of Wounded Knee, and I think South Dakota, possibly North Dakota, on the Pine Ridge Indian reservation, all designed, right, to just focus attention on kind of like that Dr. Seuss. What is it? It's the The one where the little the little people. All right, Horton hears a who. That the people of Whoville, right, are trying to convince Horton that although they're invisible to the naked eye, they are there, right? We are here, we are here, we are here. And finally, Horton hears the who's, right? He can't see them, but they're at least sort of verbally visible, orally visible. That's kind of what's happening here, right? Native Americans, a very small percentage of the population by 1968, maybe 1%, are saying, we are here and we still matter. We have a lot of problems on our reservations related to history. Don't forget about us. We matter. We're having problems with economics, education, alcoholism, diabetes, lack of economic opportunity, right? And we need redress for these very serious problems that afflict our community. To end this on a more positive note, because I do like to be optimistic, I like to think that we move, in general, we move forward over time, make progress over time, but only if we make the effort and have the political will to make progress. Time doesn't bring progress, as Dr. Martin Luther King pointed out. Time is neutral, but time can bring progress if we are determined to make that happen. So yeah, over time, things have gotten better for Native tribes here in America. You get the rise, for example, of Native American casinos, as we all know in California especially, but across the country, but mostly not in Nevada, of course. The rise of Native American gaming enterprises on reservation land, which brings economic empowerment for some tribes, not for others. That was a result of a Supreme Court decision from 1987, California v. Cabazon, in which the court held that if a state offers any sort of gambling, including lotteries, they must also allow tribes to offer gaming. So there's only 2 states that don't offer any kind of gaming, Hawaii and Utah. Right? So that's why you do not have, as far as I know, Native gaming enterprises in either Hawaii or Utah. Every other state has at least a lottery, therefore must allow Native tribes to have gaming on reservation land. And then that was codified by Congress in 1988 with the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, which basically takes, so it turns out Congress has plenary authority over the tribes. The states don't really have any authority over the tribes. But Congress said with IGRA, we're going to delegate that congressional power down to the states to negotiate with tribes on building casinos on reservation land. And states must bargain with the tribes in good faith. They must engage in good faith bargaining to make this possible without demanding too much from the tribes. And that's overseen, because my first wife was a lawyer for the Oneida Indian Tribe of Wisconsin. Where was I? That the states and how they negotiate with the tribes on gaming is overseen by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is a sub-agency of the Department of the Interior of the federal government. And what the Supreme Court has said in other cases is that the U.S. government has a uniquely sort of a caretaking role for indigenous tribes, given the history that I talked about earlier. Given that brutal history, the U.S. government has a constitutional obligation to do good things for tribes in the modern era. Right, so the BIA is highly attentive to how the states bargain with tribes on creating Native casinos on reservation land, right? They hold the states to a pretty high standard to negotiate fair deals with Native tribes for casinos. Some tribes have benefited from that quite a bit, and a lot of them haven't. Living in Wisconsin for so many years, I can tell you right now, there were 3 tribes that killed it with gaming because they were well located geographically, proximate to big urban populations. The Ho-Chunk, basically in the west, capturing the metropolitan sprawl of Madison, Wisconsin. The Potawatomi down in Milwaukee, and the Oneida up in Green Bay. Those three tribes have hit it pretty big with gaming. All the other tribes, and there's many other tribes in Wisconsin, haven't done nearly as well. There's a lot more I could say there, but we don't have time. It's an intro course. We're flying at 30,000 feet. Today, Native Americans, again, doing much better than they did even 50 years ago. Doing a lot better, much more protected under the law today, and under Supreme Court rulings. But notably, right, the minority group in America with the highest poverty rate today, Native American tribes, Native American people, 25% poverty rate for Native Americans. Black Americans at around 21% in terms of the poverty rate, Latinos at around 18%. So right, Native Americans continue to struggle, and whether it's education, alcoholism, diabetes, access to health care, health insurance, economic opportunity, especially on some of these big reservations out west. There are a lot of ongoing very serious problems in Native communities in terms of civil rights.